it's so good to be back with you. I have to say, there's something really special about doing these series and feeling like I'm back in your community. I feel like the learning with you has been something that has marked this pandemic time for me, and actually been a real blessing to be able to come into your community from afar, you in California and me over here. And I know there are some other folks in other places as well, which is just incredible. So the series we're doing today is Gems of today and the next few weeks is Gems of the Talmud. And I have to say, this is these stories. We're going to be looking at stories. Each session is going to focus on a different tractate, a different Massekhet, and we'll pull out a story from a particular tractate. So we're just getting a short little window in to 4 different tractates, the 4 different Masechet. And we're seeing some of the best stories. We're not necessarily seeing the stories that you would have learned before, I don't think necessarily, but some of the lesser known stories that are really special. And I want to say a little bit about what is it about learning stories? What is it about learning stories and learning? So we normally call these stories agadda or agadda. It's the word for stories or legends in the Talmud or in Jewish learning. And what is it about learning agadda or agadda? What's so special about these stories? I think a couple of things. For one, I think the stories, we see ourselves in the stories. We see ourselves in the stories, our lives represented, and it's a chance for us to sort of learn things and discover things about our world and ourselves that we might not have previously understood. I also think that there's a different type of learning that happens through stories, that the rabbis can, give us a halakha, can give us a certain set of Jewish laws, but then the stories come in to give us a different way into that, a different type of insight. And that stories, I think, also just there's something about stories, even as kids, we love having stories told to us. And I think that that's true as adults, that we love having stories told to us, that there's something about stories that pull on our heartstrings and that draw us in. And so for me, I feel there's a real, for those of you that were with me for the Intro to the Jewish Bookshelf series, we saw a lot of different types of texts. But if I'm being honest, my heart is really in the Talmud. And my heart is specifically really in the stories of the Talmud. So I'm particularly excited to share some of these stories with you. While we're going to be looking at 4 different tractates, 4 totally different stories that are unrelated, I will say I think that there are a couple of themes, there are a couple of questions that you're going to see come up in the different stories. Perhaps these are questions that come up in a lot of stories in the Talmud, or perhaps those are the stories that I'm most drawn to, the questions that I'm really thinking about in my life. One of the themes that I think we're going to see come up, and we're going to really explore deeply today, is a question of power. Looking at what is power? What does it mean to be powerless? Where do we find power in surprising places? We're also going to be looking at basic questions like, what are our obligations as human beings to one another? What do we owe each other? And essentially, what does it mean to be a good, decent human being in the world? The rabbis can give us the halakha, they can give us the Jewish law and what we're supposed to do, but we turn to these stories to really understand, to make sense of the world and to understand how we should be in the world, how we should live in the world, how we should be with each other. So those are some of the questions we're going to be looking at. The last thing I want to say by way of intro about stories is to say that we have a lot of different role models in the stories. Sometimes we look at sometimes the rabbis themselves, their behavior, they are the role models showing us what to do and leading the way. Sometimes it's not the rabbis. Sometimes the rabbis are actually pointing to, the anonymous man, the anonymous woman, and they are actually sort of the symbols or the pillars of righteousness, and they become our models for good behavior. And sometimes, in fact, the rabbis are the ones making mistakes. The rabbis are flawed. The rabbis are human beings. And it's not that we learn in the positive way from the rabbi's behavior. Oh, the rabbi does X, Y, and Z, so I should do X, Y, and Z. In fact, it might be, wow, the rabbis did X, Y, and Z. And I realize in this story that that's actually not something that I want to be doing, that it's through the rabbi's mistakes that we learn what we should and should not be doing in the world. That it's not always that, the rabbis are perfect, so we emulate them. It's sometimes the rabbis are human beings and flawed. And through their wrestling, through their struggling to make sense of the world and how they should live in the world, we are struggling alongside them. We are sort of partners. As they figure it out in the mess and the muck, we are also figuring out in the mess and the muck. So by way of actually just intro, and just I'll say just a brief 2 sentences about what is the Talmud. I know this is the month of the Talmud. Some of you have learned with me before. You might have gotten this elsewhere, but we can't really properly talk about the Talmud in the event that we're not totally sure what the Talmud is and where we're located. So just to give you the brief 2-sentence intro, you have the Torah. This is really intro to the Jewish bookshelf in 1 second. You have the Torah, which is the 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And as you all know, there's all sorts of different types of things in the Torah. There's genealogies, family stories, there's drama, there's law, there's sacrifices. But you wouldn't actually go to the Torah as a law book necessarily. It's not organized that way. There's all sorts of different things. And so the Mishnah, which was put together between 0 and 200 CE, that was the first attempt to make a legal code out of all the various laws of the Torah. It was given over and compiled orally. And the Mishnah between 0 and 200 CE, that's divided into 6 different starim, 6 different orders that are thematically organized. There's an order on holidays, an order on things relating to women, an order on things relating to damages and court proceedings, etc. But the Mishnah already assumed a lot of knowledge. There was a lot of shorthand. And so when the later generation of rabbis came along, just in the next generation, the rabbis from 200 to 500 CE, they had a lot of questions about the Mishnah. They had questions like, well, what did the rabbis mean when they said this? And how do I actually apply this? And so the Gemara or Talmud, I'll really use those words interchangeably. The Gemara or Talmud is the attempt of the later rabbis from 200 to 500 CE to explicate, to debate, to understand, to apply the Mishnah. And the Talmud follows the same organizational schematic as the Mishnah, in the same way that the Mishnah is divided into 6 different orders. The Gemara is divided into 6 different orders, in the same way that the Mishnah, the orders are subdivided into smaller Masechtot, into smaller tractates. So to the Gemara. And so there's a Massekhet of the Mishnah on Shabbat, which is all about Shabbat. And there's a Massekhet of the Gemara that is a commentary on that, that's all about Shabbat. Just to give you a little bit of, when I say we're pulling a text from Massekhet Tamid, you have a sense of where Tamid is located in the whole system. Okay, our session today, this is a favorite session. It has one of my favorite texts in it. All these are my favorite texts, so you should just know that. The session that we're going to be looking at today, it's really the question of what does it mean to be powerful? What does it mean to be powerful? And part of what we want to hope to uncover in this text is what are actually our own preconceived notions. When we hear the word powerful, we think of X, Y, and Z, right? When I hear someone say, so-and-so is powerful, what do I think that that means? Then we're going to unpack what do the rabbis think that that means? And ultimately, my hope is that we're going to complicate our notions of power a little bit. We're going to discover that power doesn't always look the way we think it looks, and uncover new sources of power in these stories and perhaps in ourselves. So just by ways of starting out, I'm going to ask you to use the chat. When I first say the word powerful, what comes to mind? What does powerful make you think of? What is power, or who is powerful? Okay, amazing. I'm so excited to see all of your answers coming in the chat. Just feel free to put them in there. So we've got politics. Power is influence, economic, leadership, authority. God is powerful. That's a great role model, right? That God is the ultimate one who is powerful. I saw this answer. Anita says, what is power? The ability to control others. The head of government. Powerful people have many people following them, right? So that's amazing. Sort of goes with Anita's, the ability to control others, that powerful people have many people following them. Herb says strength. Lee says, easy to misuse, the danger of power. We've got leadership, parents. It's an interesting thing about all the ways in which parents have power over their children. Mary and Jeffrey, I love this response. Humility. Would be curious to hear more. Maybe it'll come up in our session, whether humility could be a source of one's power, or whether when you have power, you have to really be careful about balancing that with humility. Very interesting to think about the relationship between power and humility. Again, we see control over people, the ability to affect the course of things. Good, so a lot of your answers are going in the direction of what is power. It's the ability to control people, to affect people. People are following me. People are looking after me. That power seems to be something about my ability to exert force on the external world and get people to do things that I want them to do. Or people are, looking to me for leadership. Jane, very different answer, being connected in the heart. Strength, living in the witness state. Responsibility, again, Howard, the ability to get what you want. Her very interesting perception. I'm not sure if that perception is that I have the perception that I have power, or other people have the perception that I have power, but the way in which one's ability to hold power actually depends on how I perceive myself and other people perceive me. That's beautiful. Okay, more to say for sure. But just appreciating your initial answers of the language we're going to use here is Ezehu Gibor, who is the one who is powerful? And you have already began populating these answers. We had a few answers connected to humility, connected to being present, connected to having heart, but a lot of your answers were about strength. They were about exerting will over someone else. They were about other people perceiving me as powerful. And so the question is, is this really what power is? And let's see what the rabbis have to say about it. So we've shared the source sheet a few times in the chat, so hopefully you have the source sheet there. And I'm also going to go ahead and start screen sharing. Just give me a moment and I will make the text bigger and nicer for us. Okay, here we are. So before we can dig into the Gemara, we're actually going to start with a little bit of Mishnah. This comes from the Mishnah. It comes from, interestingly enough, Seder Nezikin, the Seder that's all about damages and law. The tractate itself is called Pirkei Avot, the wisdom of our fathers. This is the tractate, if you haven't had a chance to learn it yet, it's a tractate that's really full of ethical teachings. It's sort of in some way the best and easiest tractate to study, because it's like all the nice bumper stickers of Judaism in one tractate of how to be a good person, how to live a good life. So it's always nice to read from Pirkei Avot. So Pirkei Avot, we're in chapter 4, Mishnayot, the Mishnah 2. So Ben Zoma Omer, who's Ben Zoma? Ben Zoma is a sage from the 1st and 2nd century. So the time of the Mishnah, the time of a little bit probably after the time of the temple. Ben Zoma Omer, Ezehu Chacham, who is the one who is wise? Answer, Halomed Mikol Adam. The one who is wise is the one who learns from every person. I just want to, as we're reading this, I don't want you to take for granted the answers of the rabbis. I almost feel like I should pause longer before I give you the answer. If I were to say to you, who is the one that is wise? Make yourself pause for a second and think of what would your answer be there? Who is the one that is wise? And then to compare that, and not only what would your answer be, and what do you think the rabbi's answer would be? And are you surprised by the answer? So to the question of who is the one who is wise, what do the rabbis say? The one who learns from every person. That's an interesting answer for the rabbis to give. So let's come back to that. Shenamar, how do we know this? Quoting from Tehillim, from the book of Psalms, Mikol milamdai hiskalti, from all of my, from all those who have taught me, from all my students, I have learned, I have gained. The idea that the teacher is actually learning from those who teach them, from those that they teach. Ezehu Gibor, so this is really our central question, though I think all these questions in this Mishnah are so interesting. Ezehu Gibor, who is the one that is mighty? And again, someone said, who is powerful? God. God is the ultimate, like in the language of the Amidah, the prayer we say 3 times a day, we refer to God as Gibor V'Norah. God is powerful and awesome. God is the ultimate Gibor. So who is the one that is mighty? Again, pause. What do you think the rabbis are going to say? What would you say? Who is the one who is mighty? Answer what they say, Hakovesh et Yitzro, the one who conquers their inclination or conquers their evil inclination. How do we know this? Tov erech apayim megibor, umoshel berucho miloched ir. Better the one who is sort of patient or slow to anger than the one who is a gibor, than strong, and the one who conquers their spirit is better than the one who captures a city. This is going to be really important for our learning today. So let me just read this again. Who is the one who is mighty? He who subdues his inclination, as it says, he that is slow to anger, is better than the mighty, and he that rules his spirit than he that takes a city. So again, I just want you to flag for yourself, and we'll talk about this in this minute. Is this what you would have expected the rabbis to say? Does this make sense to you? And or if not, what would you have expected them to say? Is it who ashir, who is the one that is wealthy, hasamech b'chalko, the one who is happy with what they have? How do we know this? It says, you shall enjoy the fruits of your labors, you shall be happy, and you shall prosper. You shall be happy in this world, and you shall prosper in the world to come. Last one, Ezehu mechubad, who is the one that is honored? Again, just pause there for a second. The rabbis are asking, who is the one that is honored? What do you think the answer might be? Who is the one who is honored? Answer, hamechabed et habriyot, the one who honors and gives honor to other creatures and other beings. It's an interesting answer. Who is the one who is honored? Hamechabed et habriyot, the one who honors other people. How do we know this? Shnei Amar, for coming from the book of Samuel, for I honor those that honor me, but those who spurn me shall be dishonored. So who is the one that God honors? The one that honors God, the one that gives honor. Who is the one who is honored? The one who gives honor to other people. Okay, so there's a lot here. We have multiple questions. Ultimately, we're going to be focused on this Ezehu Gibor. I'm curious to see just in the chat, if you want to throw in, here's sort of the questions I'd be interested in hearing you respond to. One is, if we take all these questions together, do you see something uniting or similar in the responses to these questions? Is there something about the answers that sort of holds these questions together? A second question is, what do you think about these answers? Are they the answers you would have expected the rabbis to give? Are they surprising? How do they align with what you would have either said yourself or what the rabbis would have said? So go ahead and just take some time and put that in the chat, and then we'll read out some of your responses. So a lot of people are saying sort of a common theme here in all these questions is about humility. It's very interesting. I would love to hear more about, is it Mia? I would love to hear more about the theme of other-centered, of what you mean by it, that they're centered on the other. I see them as examples of humility and care. Okay, again, I assume God would be more the answer, that we would be looking to God as the answer to some of these, or looking to God as the answer for what is a Gibor. Right, it's interesting to think, if we think that God is the ultimate example of Gibor, what do we think that means? When we call God Gibor, what does that mean? When we call God Gibor, does it mean because God is koveshet yitzro, because God subdues God's inclination? Or do we mean Gibor in a different sense? Mimi says we can strive to have control over ourselves first. Yeah. So Mary writes, I appreciate Mary and Jeffrey that you're saying who's writing what so that I can really acknowledge you properly. Mary writes, the one who is content with himself and respectful to others has power. No one really said that in our intro comments. That's a great definition of power. It's an interesting definition of power, the one who's content with himself and respectful to others. Deb says, it makes sense to me, but I know they are only talking about men. Yes, you can often assume that these texts are talking about men, and that's an interesting thing to remember as you're reading them. Anita says, appreciation and gratitude. Just a flag, you can see I'm not reading out all of your comments, but it's not because they're not all really valuable and amazing. It's just because my eye can only read so many. And I know that you are all reading out all of each other's comments. So please keep reading each other's comments. Jeff says, centered on the issue of ego. Yeah, I would, again, I'd love to hear more what you mean by that. Something that I notice about these texts that I think is so interesting is that, in fact, you might have thought these answers of who is mighty or who is rich or who is happy or who is honored, that the answers would be in relationship to other people, right? When we said who is mighty, the answer was the one who controls the other people, the one who other people follow them, the other people perceive as strong. And actually, it turns out, according to the rabbis, that strength and might have nothing to do with other people at all. It has very much to do with my relationship to myself. Am I able to conquer myself, subdue myself? That the more might is not about my relationship to the other people. I might have thought, who is wealthy? The one who has more money than everyone else, right? I judge wealth by how much money I have and how little money you have, but it's not about that. It's all about my relationship to myself. What do I have? And am I satisfied with my have, that I can define my wealth having nothing to do with the economics of the time and how much everyone else has? How often is that how we define wealth? Normally we define wealth based on what I have and someone else has. That we might have thought, I mean, this is the most obvious one. Who is the one who is honored? The obvious answer there is the one that other people honor, the one that other people turn to and respect and put up on a horse and parade through town and give power. There's a really obvious answer here. Who is the one who is honored? The one who other people honored. And so for the rabbis to give this very different answer, no, the one who is honored, it's not about how other people see me. Do other people honor me? It's about, do I honor other people? That all of the answers here don't depend on how other people relate to me. Do other people listen to me? How do other people perceive me? They're actually all things that, based on these answers, the rabbis are putting squarely in my control. I can control these things. I can control how strong I am, because it's about whether or not I'm conquering myself. I can control my sense of wealth because it's about my own satisfaction and gratitude. I can control whether or not I am honored, which is a crazy idea. That my ability to be mechubad, to be honored, doesn't depend on anyone else. What it depends on is my ability to honor others. And so all these, I think, are actually pretty radical answers in which the rabbis are saying all these other things that you might have thought are dependent upon other people see you are actually entirely dependent on you. And again, I think that this definition for me of Ezehu Gibor, this is really going to be what we're going to drive home. Today, our focus is who is the one that is mighty, especially if we look to God as the ultimate source of might. It's an interesting answer. I might have thought, who is the one who is mighty? Right here. I might have thought, who is the one who is mighty? The one who can conquer a city. That's the one who is mighty. And this verse is specifically coming to say, no, that's not the one who is mighty. The one who is mighty is the one who can control their own spirit, forget conquering the city. Okay, I'm going to turn to the chat just to see if anyone had any responses to all of that. Feel free to throw that into the chat. Oh, good, Howard. You can't control anything or anyone else unless you can control yourself. And if you have any desires for your own aggrandizement, others can use that threat to control you. So the most powerful are the most selfless. Appreciate that. So Rhea says, these answers by the rabbis is for the sake of a healthy community. Right, it's interesting to think about how they could be crafting their answers for what is the community, what is the type of community we want to live in, where people are, trying to see who has power over other people, where they're comparing themselves to other people. No, we want to live in a society where we're all working on ourselves, we're concerned with ourselves and making ourselves be the best people. Okay. Thank you for all of those comments. So continue to feel free to write them in the chat. So the Mishnah is asking this question, Ezehu Gibor, and now we're going to turn to the Talmud. We're going to turn to Massekhet Tamid, which is really a Massekhet that's about offerings in the temple, the Tamid offering, and we're going to get an amazing text. So the text is, this is something that the Gemara sometimes does. The rabbis imagine what I imagine are hypothetical conversations, sometimes between non-Jewish rulers and the sages being in conversation. And this is one such text where we're going to see Alexander the Great from the 4th century BCE. Alexander the Great, one of the greatest military conquerors of that time. He was thought to be, he was undefeated. He's thought to be one of the most successful military commanders. We're having the rabbis, sort of the writers of this story, put Alexander the Great in conversation with the sages. So even before you read this text, you can't see what I'm doing this. I'm covering the text with my hands, and so that's going to prevent you from reading the text. I should just stop screen sharing. Even if you're before you read the text, if you just imagine, what do you think hypothetically, if you were to imagine Alexander the Great being in conversation with the sages, what do you think that conversation would be? Like, what do you think that they would be talking about? What do you think Alexander the Great would be saying to the rabbis? And what do you think the rabbis would want to say to Alexander the Great? Just that thought exercise. Feel free to put that in the chat or not. We'll go ahead and dive in. So Alexander said to the elders, who is truly worthy of being called wise? Ezehu chacham. Sounds familiar. We just had this here. Ezehu chacham. Who said that? Ben Zoma. Who's saying it now? We're putting the language, the question of who is wise. It's no longer Ben Zoma who's asking the question and giving the answer. Now it's Alexander the Great as asking the question. We're putting the line of the Mishnah in Alexander the Great's mouth, and he's asking the rabbis. So Alexander the Great says to the rabbis, Ezehu chacham, and what do they say back to him? If you remember in the Mishnah, the answer was, who is wise? The one who learns from every person. Again, I just want to say, we didn't talk about this. That is a striking answer for the rabbis. For a group of people that are really dedicated to Torah and books and continual learning, you really might have thought that who is the one who is wise? The one who has memorized the entire Gemara and knows all of halakha and can quote anything from memory, and that's not the answer. That's crazy. That's really interesting, that the answer to who is wise is the one who learns from every person. Here we're going to get a different answer. Alexander the Great supposedly asked the rabbis, Ezehu chacham, who is wise? Haro'eh et hanolad. This is an amazing line. Who is wise? The one who sees the consequences of their actions. So I want to come back in a minute to what that means. What does it mean? The one who is wise is the one who ro'eh et hanolad. Quite literally, the one who sees, and nolad is what is born, sees the outcome, is able to anticipate what's going to happen. He said to them, Alexander the Great, who is truly worthy of being called mighty? Again, you see in the Hebrew, he says, Ezehu gibor. Alexander the Great didn't say this. The rabbis are putting the Mishnah, the questions of the Mishnah, into the mouth of Alexander the Great in this amazing constructed conversation. So now Alexander the Great is saying, Ezehu gibor. What is the answer? Hakovesh et yitzro. Same answer that the Mishnah gives. The one who conquers his ego. That is the answer. The rabbis are saying that back to Alexander the Great. Then he says, who is the one who is worthy of being called wealthy? They said to him, right, who is Ashir? Amrale, Ezehu Ashir hasamech b'choko. The one who is satisfied with his portion. So before we even go on with this text, what do you make of Ro'eh et hanolad? What do you make of this different answer to who is wise, the one who sees the consequence of their actions? And what do you just make of what's happening here in this little piece? Why are the rabbis putting the questions of the Mishnah into the mouth of Alexander the Great? Like, what do you think they're trying to do here? What do you make of suddenly these answers to who is wise, to who is mighty, to who is wealthy, that these are the answers that they're saying back to Alexander the Great? What do you make of this conversation? Okay, go ahead and put it on the chat, and I'm going to turn to the chat now. So Neil says, it seems like the answer to a political and military leader who wants to be recognized. Great. Cindy says, the rabbis are trying to teach him humility and compassion. Yeah, it's amazing that here is Alexander the Great, the most powerful, right? I guess I'll use the word powerful in quotes, but not really. In a sense, the most, if power is about the ability to exert your will, have followers, make other people do what you want, then one of the most powerful people of that time period, in 300 BCE, powerful, undefeated military conquest. And what are the rabbis saying to him? They're saying, you want to know who really is wise? The one who's able to see the outcome of their behavior. What does that mean to Alexander the Great? You want to know who really is wealthy? The one who's happy with what they have. You want to know who is mighty? It's not the one who's conquering the entire world, Alexander the Great. It's the one who is able to conquer their own yetzer, their own inclination. Let me see what Howard is saying here. Wisdom and the ability to foresee the future consequences of what is done now are not equivalent to power. They only become powerful if one has the ability to mobilize the resources that make what is happening now actually happen. So that's very interesting, Howard. You're connecting the what does it mean to be wise? Okay, to be wise is to see the outcome, but then power is actually the ability to mobilize the resources to either to do something about that, to affect that in some way. Very interesting. Deb says, the wise one is a person who can take a step back and not answer emotionally or too quickly without thinking things through. Yeah, Deb, I really love that. Part of that is taking a step back and saying, like, wait a second, what is going to be the outcome of this behavior? I think about who is wise, the one who sees the outcome. I think about that a lot with my kids, that when my kids are roughhousing and all right, you'll probably relate to this. When the kids are roughhousing and they're happy and they're laughing like manically and everything's to be going well, but I know that in 2 seconds, what's going to be the outcome? They're going to break the television. They're going to break each other. One of them is going to be hysterics. The other one's going to be like bitten on the floor. But at that moment, everything seems to be happy and good. But the one who is wise is able to look past that moment and say, this isn't going to go the way we want it to go. Okay. Ari says, the rabbis are using a great leader, non-rabbi, to teach their own rabbinic leaders the lessons. It's amazing.
Not non-rabbinic. They're saying, if you look at a synagogue, you have rabbis and people in the religious world, and then you have the titans of industry who sit next to you in the pews, and they're saying to titans of industry, look what Alexander the Great has to say. So you should listen to him, not just us.
That's very funny. I like that. What I think that is so interesting about this whole constructed thing is like, who really has power? Who would you think really has power between the rabbis and Alexander the Great? You would imagine Alexander the Great, the greatest military conqueror of all time, probably is more powerful than the rabbis or has some sort of power over the rabbis. But what's amazing is through writing or through Torah, through oral tradition, the rabbis are exerting a type of power over Alexander the Great because they're constructing this exchange with him. They're putting words in the mouth of the great Alexander the Great. Okay, let's go on a little bit with this text. So he goes on, he says to them, what must a man do and thereby ensure that he will live? They said to him, such a man must kill himself. This is a very mysterious answer that you'd have to think a little bit more about. What must someone do to live? They must kill themselves. So what does that mean? Alexander further inquired, what must a man do and ensure that he will die? They said to him, such a man must keep himself alive. Again, very enigmatic answer. He said to them, what must a man do and ensure that he will be accepted by the people? They said to Alexander, he must hate the king and the authorities. Alexander said to them, mine is better than yours. He must love the king and the authorities, but he must perform beneficial acts for people. I think I'm particularly interested in this last section. I think it's interesting. What must a man do and ensure that he will be accepted by the people? If you want to gain goodwill, if you want to be popular, what should you do? Specifically, how should you relate to a ruling government? One answer, the Jewish answer, the rabbinic answer is hate the king and the authorities. If you want to gain the power of the people, if you want to be well-liked, presumably by the Jewish people, what do? You show that you're anti the oppressive king and you show that you're anti the oppressive government. And Alexander says, that's not the way to do it. Good for you for hating on the king and the oppressive authority. That's not going to get you anywhere. What is actually more useful is to love the king and the authorities, to get yourself close and curry favor, but then use that as power to perform acts for the people. I think that this is just thinking about sort of politics today and government is how do you sort of as a dissenter approach a government that you don't disagree with? Is the right way to curry favor and become popular in the eyes of the people just to rail against the current government? Or do you actually get yourself close to the government so that you're then able to use that power to do something? And here, Alexander the Great seems to say, and the rabbis let Alexander the Great have the last word, that Alexander the Great seems to say, my way is better. What you're doing is not actually going to help you. It's not actually going to help you make change. Let's read just a little bit more, and then I want to hear your comments again. He said to them, again, Alexander the Great asked me more questions. Again, just thinking about what's going on in this narrative here. Who has power? You would think Alexander the Great, but the rabbis have constructed this sort of fanciful narrative, this fanciful conversation where Alexander the Great is coming to the rabbis with all these questions about the meaning of life and how do I live and what should I do? And it's the rabbis that are providing Alexander the Great the answers. So he said to them, is it better to live at sea or is it better to live on dry land? They said to him, it is better to live on dry land, as all seafarers, their minds are constantly unsettled until they reach the dry land. I love this one. I just love that there was something about recognizing that what it means to metaphorically be out sea, that sometimes in our lives we are at sea, which means the ground is constantly shifting underneath us. And the rabbis are recognizing is that it's very hard to be at sea. It's very hard to be in a terrain that's constantly shifting, that it's only when we're able to get to dry land that we're able to have our minds settled. Okay, I'm curious to hear, this was a lot in here. There was a strange section about, what must you do to live, to kill yourself, to die, you must keep yourself alive. This section about currying favor with the government, the section about the sea. I'm curious to hear, feel free in the chat, any sort of responses. What do you think is going on here? What's the learning that we're supposed to be taking away from this? So Chris says, it's better to work inside the system in order to change it and make a difference. Yeah, Chris, I think that that's exactly right. It's, again, I think it's interesting. It feels to me, because Alexander gets the last word in this particular exchange, that it's almost as if the rabbis are like, there might actually be something to that. That might actually be the right way to do it. Okay, let's feel free to put, so Beverly says, previous section relates to those in the previous government who disagreed with the leader, who decided between staying with their jobs and trying to have an influence or leaving completely. Right, very much so. I think, to me, I think that this is something profound about reading the stories of the rabbis. Here you have this hypothetical imagined story in a text that was written from 200 to 500 CE about a Greek ruler from 300 BCE. And yet the question of how do you relate to a ruling government that you disagree with? Do you hate on the government and that's the way to gain favor? Or do you try to join the government to work from within? That this is actually a conversation that really relates to us today and that we see people wrestling with. So Jeff says, regarding being at sea, a metaphor about being what you are. Humans are of the land, fish and whales are of the sea. The being at sea is artificial. So we need to understand our roots, which is humans on land, a metaphor for grounding. I like that very much. This is so Buddhist, beautiful. Okay, good. So we're getting to the part about killing and living. So Arnold says, no man can ensure that he will live. It is folly. The reality is that we all will die. This is the wise man, and he should live to share his wisdom. Anita wants to understand better the issue of killing oneself and living to ensure dying. Yeah, so I think that's a really hard one. I would be curious to hear if people want to respond directly to that. What must a man do and thereby ensure that he will live? Such a man must kill himself. I think what they're saying is, I think this goes back to the issue of koveshet yitzro, to conquer one's ego, that they have to maybe kill the parts of themselves that are maybe would be gluttonous, would lead them astray, would encourage them to pursue things that would be sort of lustful or in vain or whatever it is, that they have to sort of like sublimate or kill the parts of themselves that would lead them astray, and it's only through that they're going to be able to live. I also think, I wonder if this is connected to humility, that in order to truly be able to live, we have to humble ourselves, and the killing ourselves is connected to that. And we have to sort of so humble those parts of ourselves, and then only will we be able to live. And what must a man do and ensure that he will die? Such a man must keep himself alive. I think what it means is, I think this goes back to what Arnold was saying, is as soon as we get into the focus of, I just want to live, sort of pursuing life at all costs, is folly and inevitably will lead to our demise or will lead to our downfall, or sort of that pursuit, single-mindedly pursuit of I'm just pursuing my own vitality and livelihood might actually be the thing that injures us. I think that this is a complicated part to understand. Just seeing if there are other thoughts in here. Kill the ego. Yeah, Deb, I think that is also a great way to understand that, going back to the humility of kill the ego, and that's the thing that's going to allow us to really live. Or kill the Yetzer Hara. Again, I think that's going back to the who is powerful, the one who conquers the ego. Good. Okay, let's read on a bit more. We're going to do a bit of this a bit quickly because I want to make sure that we get to one of my favorite sections. So then he goes on and he says, who among you is wiser? They said to him, we are all equal. And every matter that you say to us, we solve for you unanimously. He said to them, what is this that you oppose me? They don't like his answer, right? He says, who is wiser? And they say, we can answer anything. Like, we're all united front against you. They say, who are you that oppose me? And they say to him, Satan nitzach. Satan is victorious. This is another hard line to understand. I think what it means is that it is as if they are saying, even Satan is sometimes victorious, but that doesn't mean that Satan is right. Meaning to say, like, it might be that you have more powerful. It might be that you sometimes succeed in your conquering, but that just puts you on par with Satan. That doesn't mean that you are actually righteous or correct, and that's why we oppose you. Just because you win, just because you are successful in your conquest, doesn't mean that you are actually in the right and you should be unopposed. And so then he says, feeling challenged, consequently, I am executing you by the edict of kings. Again, just thinking about power as the underlying thing here. He says, how dare you challenge me? And they say, you may be more powerful, but that doesn't make you right. He says, I will execute you by the edict of the kings, right? There is him flaunting his who is powerful. They said to him, certainly the authority is in the hands of the king. You have the power, but falsehood, lying is unbecoming for the king. Immediately, Alexander dressed them in garments of purple and placed golden chains upon their neck. I think the way we're supposed to understand this is, he says to them, I'll just kill you. I have the power to do so. And they say, you could do so, but that's not going to look good for you. That perception is not going to be good. And Alexander recognizes the rightness of the rabbi's argument that they are correct. And so that dressing them in garments of purple is like dressing them in royal garb, elevating him in status, giving them the golden chains, and ultimately saying, like, well, I guess I won't kill you. You've used your reason to sort of stay in the game. I'm not going to just kill you now. I will raise you up. I will make you advisors. He said to them, I want to go to the country of Africa. They said to him, you will not be able to go there as the mountains of darkness block. He said, it's sort of amazing, the idea of Hare Choshech, the mountains of blackness. Here is Alexander, who is the ultimate conqueror, who can't be stopped from going anywhere. Even past these mountains of darkness, I will get there. He said to them, it is not possible for me not to go. And it is due to this reason that I ask you, rather, what might I do? Again, this is the ultimate Alexander the Great of, I am going to conquer the world. It's not possible for me to not continue wanting more and more and more. What I'm asking you is not, can I do it? It's how do I do it? Again, thinking about the power that the rabbis are trying to take on, and now it's Alexander the Great coming to the rabbis for advice on how to go about getting through these mountains. So they said to him, bring Libyan donkeys that walk even in darkness, and bring coils of rope and tie one end of rope on this near side, so that when you come to return by the same path, you may take hold and you will come back to your place. The rabbis managed to talk him through how to walk through these mountains of darkness. This is my favorite part. Alexander did this and went. He came to a certain town whose entire population was women, and he wanted to wage battle against them. The women said to him, if you kill us, people will say, Alexander kills women. And if we kill you, people will say, Alexander is the king whom women killed in battle. Alexander said to them, bring me bread. They brought him bread of gold upon a table of gold. Alexander said to the woman, do people eat bread of gold? Meaning, why did I ask for bread and you brought me this gold? I didn't ask for gold. They said to him, but if all you wanted was bread, didn't you have bread to eat in your own place? It was not for bread that you took up campaign and toiled and came here. That's their answer back to them. Like they sort of outsmart him and say, he says, give me bread. They bring him gold. He says, who wants gold? I asked for bread. And they say, clearly you didn't come here. Don't you have bread where you came from? You came here to sort of conquer us. When Alexander left and came, he wrote upon the gate of the town, I, Alexander of Macedon, was a fool until I came to the country of Africa of women, and I learned sense from women. So you have this, some clapping. So there's just so much going on in this long text. I know we're covering a lot. You have all the back and forth. I want to talk about the story in particular, but I would characterize this whole narrative as the question of this text is, what is power? Who is powerful? What does power look like? First, you have this exchange the rabbis are constructing between themselves and between Alexander the Great. There's a question there about who is powerful in that exchange and what does power look like. And then you have this exchange with the women. Alexander the Great, who is undefeated, who conquers the entire world, he gets to a village of women, a town of women, and what happens? They defeat him. So I'm curious to hear your responses to this text as a whole, but specifically to this section with the women. What do you think is going on in this text? What is this text trying to teach us about power? Okay, so go ahead, and I'm curious to see your responses in the chat. Powerful, power Black women, I'm all in. Yeah, it's an amazing story. Rochelle says, you're never powerless. You can subvert the powerful, especially by doing exactly as they demand. So Rochelle, that's beautiful. I love this lesson of who is so obviously powerful in the story. It's Alexander the Great. He's the rabbis very deliberately pick the undefeated military general. But the lesson here is, first of all, they give a different notion of power. Power is very specifically, they quote from that Psalm, say, power is not about conquering city, it's about conquering yourself, right? Alexander the Great, maybe you need to figure that out, but that actually, you think you might be powerless, but even the rabbis who all they had were their words, they actually used their words to have power over Alexander the Great. And these women, that it's by doing, amazing, Rochelle, it's by giving him literally exactly what he asked for, that they're able to have power over him. And it's this power that's actually the power of logic, the power of using their minds. Deb says, to be wise, you need to be able to listen to everybody, at least a little with an unbiased mind. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this goes back to, I think, that opening the Mishnah, the answer of who is wise, the one who is able to learn from everyone. Deb says, who is wise, the one who is able to listen to everyone. That's really interesting. That's a very different definition of who is wise. So Ari, power is based on intelligence, not brute strength. I think that definitely is what the rabbis are trying to drive home here. I think that is true. I think that this is a text in which power is being, certainly the power of Alexander the Great is being subverted, both on the behalf of the women and also the rabbis. And the way that that's happening in both ways is through intelligence, is through wit, it's through conversation. Mary says, the women outsmarted him. Jeff says, oh, the analogies to Trump here. I'll leave that comment as it is. I think this section shows that Alexander learned who is wise. He thought about the consequences of his actions, conquer, and it said acknowledge that he learned from others, women. Cindy, amazing. So there's almost a sense, Cindy, in which you're saying you see a trajectory in this text, and that the beginning is Alexander, which is sort of amazing to think about the rabbis building in that trajectory, that at the beginning of the text, Alexander the Great comes to them as like, who is wise? And they say, Haroed Honolah, the one who sees the consequence of his actions. That's amazing, Cindy. And then when you get to the women, that's exactly what's happened. They're laying, originally, he doesn't see the consequences of his actions. And it's the women who actually lay out for him and say, well, if you kill us, they're going to say this about you. And if we kill you, they're going to say this about you. So this is actually a no-win situation. They're teaching them how to think through those steps. And then ultimately, as Cynthia is pointing out, he learns the lesson. And then he acknowledges that he learned something from the women. Something that I think is interesting about this text that I'm not sure about. It's a little bit ambivalent. When Alexander left and came, he wrote upon the gate of the town, I, Alexander of Macedon, was a fool, and so I came to the country of Africa women. It's not clear whether he wrote this on the gate of his town or the gate of the town in which he was leaving. There's a sense in which if let's say he writes it on the gate of the town of the women, he writes on the gate of the town of the women, he's acknowledging that the women defeated him and that he learned something from them. The other thing that I'll just say is a little bit backhanded is that here was this town of entirely women, and he's inscribed his own name onto their gate. There's a sense in which like he couldn't actually leave it as all women, that he puts himself into that town. Neil says, by using women as the teachers, it takes the typical masculine ego power dynamic out of it. Yeah, I think it's really interesting and striking that the rabbis could have proved their point. I mean, the rabbis could have constructed this whole fanciful conversation with Alexander the Great and just had it be a back and forth between them and Alexander the Great. We outsmarted Alexander the Great. We're so smart. But that actually the rabbis then have this town, this country in Africa of all women, and that ultimately they are the ones who defeat Alexander, is really amazing. That the women become the ultimate giborim, right? The women become the ultimate people of strength, even in a sense more so than the rabbis. Howard says, Jews have historically been in the same relation to the politically or military powerful in the secular world as women have been to the physical power of men. It's interesting, Howard, to think about how that dynamic plays in. Cindy says, the inscription of his name on the gate was Alexander exercising his power. I wonder, let's read that with Deb's comment. I don't think Alexander wrote on the women's gate because he left the women and came to somewhere else. Right. Yeah, I don't know. It's right. So I think that there's something, so Deb, I think that that's totally a fair reading. I think that I've seen this text sort of written and translated both ways. Once where it seemed like he was writing on the gate of the women, and once where he was writing on wherever the gate is that he came to. I think that there's something, because you would have thought it would say, when Alexander left and returned home, he wrote on the gate of the town. There's something weird about the language. But Deb, I think that you could be right that he's not writing on the gate of the women, or it could be, as I was suggesting, and as Cindy is saying, that it actually is a last, even as he's admitting defeat to the women, he's still doing it in a way that he's preserving his own power by inscribing his name on their very gate. Okay, let me stop screen sharing for a moment. And say, you could see that the text goes on. It's a very rich text to spend time with and to really think about. What I just wanted to put forward to you, starting with where we began, is I think that whoever made that initial comment of who is powerful, really the source of ultimate power is God. I mean, one, I want to suggest it is God, and that we might have thought that power looked a certain way, that power is about military power, that power is about strength, power is about exerting force. You then see in the Mishnah the idea that power is actually none of those things. It's about conquering ourselves. And then beautifully, the rabbis extend and teach this lesson by putting those words in Alexander's mouth. And who are we really teaching this lesson about conquering our own Yetzer to? None other than Alexander the Great. And that it's through their words, through their debate, through their wit and their logic, that both the rabbis managed to assume a power over Alexander the Great that they might never have had in life, but that also that they give a power to these women, that it's ultimately the women that manage to defeat Alexander the Great, even if it only happens in the Gemara, if it doesn't happen in real life, that the one town that's able to defeat him, that he is not able to conquer, is actually this colony of women in Africa, that it's through their logic they find power. Let me turn it, I know, Ari, you always have final thoughts. Do you want to add any thoughts to the story of what you're thinking about?
Well, first of all, once again, I'm very impressed with our audience. Questions, participation. You get A+ today. That's a high grade. While you were teaching, I was just looking up to see how many times is Alexander the Great mentioned in the Talmud. I would love to know if people in our group actually knew that Alexander the Great was mentioned in the Talmud before today. I have a feeling most people did not know that, but Alexander the Great is actually mentioned other places in the Talmud. So I found some other places, and Alexander the Great was beloved by the Jewish community. In fact, the name Alexander was adopted, I understand, in the Jewish world based on Alexander the Great. So I wanted people to know that. And the second is there are stories about Alexander the Great and the Amazons. And the Amazons and the Greco-Roman world go way back. So my question to you is, obviously the rabbis knew a lot more about the Greco-Roman world than we assumed they did. And they were more involved in the politics than we assumed. They were not holed up in their own world of rabbinic thought. So it was great to see them bring Alexander here. And I'm wondering if any other world leaders are brought into the Talmud that we should know about besides Alexander the Great.
There are. I don't know if I can give them to you offhand, but yeah, this is in the same way, Ari, that you're pointing out that this is not the first and only time that Alexander the Great comes in their imagined conversations with him. I'd have to look up who the other leaders are, but there are also other constructed conversations of the rabbis in conversation with other real world leaders. I don't know that they were living. I mean, these rabbis are not living contemporaneously with Alexander. Yeah, Vespasian, Anita, that's a great one. With other leaders where they're similarly being put in relationship with other real world leaders and having interactions and conversations with them. It's sort of just amazing to think about. I don't think these interactions were actually happening, but it's a safe way for the rabbis to play out these ideas on the page and like, well, what would have happened? What would we have said? What do we think Alexander the Great would have learned from us? And what would we have learned from Alexander the Great? Yeah.
I'm not sure that rabbis learned the story about the women that they taught us today in the page until later on in history. So it's a story that was in the Talmud, but really played out later in history, right? Today we're learning the power of the intelligence and the power of women. So yeah. It was a great story. What are we learning? What story are we going to learn about next week?
That's a good question. Let me see what I have planned for next week. Yes. Oh, I love this one. Next week, we're turning to Massekhet Tamid. This is a Massekhet that's all about, literally Ta'anit means fast, but this is a Massekhet where the rabbis are wrestling with, what do we do? How do we face a plague? How do we face a pandemic? How do we face a drought? So this is a Massekhet that I've been teaching from a lot right now. The rabbis are wrestling with the same questions that we're wrestling with, those questions of powerlessness, of what happens when we have no rain for months and months and on end. What happens when people around us are dying in a pandemic? What do we do? Turning to prayers and to fasting and to other things. And specifically, what we're going to be looking at is a series of stories on whose prayers are answered during the time of a drought. Whose prayers do we think God listens to? And what makes prayer effective or not effective?
I'm just going to go with the women in Africa.
Yeah.
Based on this story.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for teaching today and continuing our month of Talmud. The hope is that you will all be interested in new stories you never heard of, or if it's a story you've heard of, you'll approach it a different way. And I think the most important part of this series is interaction and your interaction. So keep the thoughts coming and keep participating in the series. And thank you to Rabbi Avi. For those of you who are new, you should know this is our third series with Rabbi Avi Strausberg from Hadar. And we appreciate learning with you as always. Thank you everybody for participating and for your great teaching as well. I think that's all I have for today.
So, have a great day, everyone. So good to see you. Thank you for your comments.
Good seeing you, Neil and Mimi and the Phillipses and Chris and I see Jeff Podless and of course Rosa Berman, who is the most recent person to make a donation to CSP. So thank you, a double donation actually. So thank you, and thank you, and John Bind. Is it Bind or Bindi? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but welcome. Good to see you guys. I got to go have lunch and get some work done. We'll see you on Sunday. Take care. Be safe.